Hi, YouTube. My name is Jack, and I am very jet-lagged. I was in the United Kingdom for the past 2 weeks or so. I went for my birthday, stayed with a friend, had a really wonderful time. Went to Stonehenge on my birthday, went to Glastonbury, went to Avebury, did all kinds of sort of magical sightseeing, went to, various pagan sacred sites, had a really wonderful, wonderful time. I'm a little overloaded with religion right now because I've seen so many Neolithic sites and sacred sites of the goddess and things like that. Like, I kind of need to live a very mundane life for the next couple of weeks because I've had so much magic and religion. But it was really just a fantastic time. And while I was there, I had the opportunity to meet and hang out with a handful of people who are, in the Gardnerian community, whom I know largely from online, right? I recognize their names, I know their faces, but don't really get much opportunity to hang out with them in person because we're an ocean away from each other. So that was really cool, just sort of seeing people, hanging out, getting to know people a little bit more face to face. And while I was there, I was really struck by some of the general differences, some of the broad differences between the cultures of Wicca in America and in Britain. Because they're quite different from each other. There are ways in which they're very similar, but there are also, broadly speaking, some ways in which they diverge. And I figured I'd take some time today to talk about those differences. This is not going to be anything terribly groundbreaking, right? These differences have all been noticed and remarked upon before by other people, but these are just things that were sort of going through my head while I was in the UK. And I think they're worth talking about here because there's quite a lot of discussion of them, like among initiates, right? Gardnerian initiates who are in the UK and in the US talk to each other quite a lot. But those conversations are more often had behind closed doors and are not necessarily had in a more public facing, outward oriented way, where, if you're a seeker, it might be interesting and relevant to you to know that Wicca as it exists in the US and Wicca as it exists in the UK are relatively different from each other. Obviously, there are no universals here. Each coven is different, and so I'm going to talk about the broad climate of Wicca in the US versus the UK, but there's a great deal of variation. I don't mean to say all American covens are like X, all British covens are like Y. I'm just sort of giving general vibes. And I think, particularly if you're a seeker, if you're thinking about learning about Wicca, if you're interested in seeking initiation, it's worth being aware of some of the cultural differences because if you're in the UK and you're reading books by American authors, you might be like, wait, like we don't do any of this. Why are the Americans talking about this? Why this is describing something very different than the Wicca I've been exposed to, and vice versa if you're in America and you're reading books by British authors. And I think it just helps to be a little bit aware of that uh, cultural difference. So I'm going to talk about three things very broadly. Um, the first is that the word Wicca itself means something quite different in the US versus in the UK. In the UK, generally speaking, when people say Wicca, they are referring to Gardnerian and Alexandrian initiatory traditional Wicca. And in the US, Wicca is a much broader term. I actually have a video, which I'll link up here somewhere, about sort of what is Wicca. Wicca in the US includes Gardnerian and Alexandrian traditional Wicca, but it also includes a number of other traditions that don't trace initiatory descent from Gardner and Sanders. So, for example, Blue Star Wicca is a tradition of Wicca that exists in the United States, Mosean Wicca, and so on. But the term Wicca in America also includes solitary practice, eclectic practice, non-lineaged, non-hierarchical, very different sorts of practice. And I think the reason for that is largely a matter of history and geography. So Wicca in the UK, because the UK is quite small, sort of never had a need to. That's a bad way of starting that sentence. Particularly in the early days in the UK, but up to today, if you were interested in Wicca, if you were interested in paganism and you wanted to explore pagan religious witchcraft, there was always an accessible coven that was somewhere you could get to. Because the British Isles are quite small, really. Um, And so if you were looking for a coven, there would be someone who you could get to. It might be a pain in the ass, it might be a 6-hour drive, but you would be able to get to someone in order to receive Wiccan training. And so there was always a Wiccan coven nearby, nearby being a relative term. Whereas in the United States, Wicca comes to the States in the early 60s, and there's one coven on New York that's capped out at, a dozen people. And there's a whole continent of people who are interested in pagan religious witchcraft who don't have access to training. Even today, that's true. The United States is so large that there are huge swaths of the country where there are no Gardnerian or Alexandrian initiates. Um, and, even on the seekers groups today, we'll still get people who are like, hey, is there anyone in Utah? And the answer is no, you know? Or, there's a coven and it's a 14-hour drive from you. And there are some people who don't have access to anyone who's not, flying distance away. They don't have access to anyone they could drive to. And if you're able to fly once a week to go meet a coven and receive training, that's a wonderful thing. There are certainly people who do that. But there are also people who, work minimum wage jobs and don't have access to the resources to do that, and that's also totally fine. But because of that, when Wicca comes to the US, demand vastly exceeds supply. And so you get a lot of people who start inventing their own traditions based on published sources and their own personal gnosis, or you get people who are doing sort of eclectic stuff. Obviously Ray Buckland published The Tree in, I want to say 1971, something like that, but introduces the concept of Seax Wicca, where you can self-initiate and practice on your own. Then we have Dorian Valiente with Witchcraft for Tomorrow, suggests sort of a similar thing. And Scott Cunningham, most famously, with Wicca, A Guide for the Solitary Practitioner. And these books sort of make the concept of solitary, individual Wicca accessible and available for people. And a lot of people in the US who are interested in Wicca and don't have access to a traditional group start doing that. So Wicca in the US describes a whole range of practices, some of which are traditional, lineaged, and initiatory, but many of which are not. Whereas in the UK, there has never been a need for that, because the balance of supply and demand has always been decently sort of in proportion. And so in the UK, if you're interested in Wicca, you can just find a Wiccan coven. And most Brits I've interacted with, when they use the term Wicca, they're only referring to Gardnerian or Alexandrian Wicca. Similarly, actually, Gardnerian and Alexandrian Wicca, the communities are one and the same in the UK. Gardnerians circle with Alexandrians quite freely. In the US, they're generally thought of as different communities and different traditions, and while there are some people who overlap, there's a lot less overlap between the Gardnerian and Alexandrian communities in America than there is in the UK. In the UK, it's sort of like we're all initiates, we're all of the Wicca, it's not a big deal. And in the US, the traditions came to America at different times. They settled in different places. So Gardnerian Wicca comes to New York. Alexandrian Wicca comes to a different part of the US, a little bit farther north. Initially, at least. Obviously, people have spread across the country since then. But the communities were just sort of separate from each other. And only now are people really starting to work to build ties between them and maybe foster a greater sense of interconnectedness. So that's the first thing about Wicca, is just that the word Wicca means something different in the UK versus the US. The second thing I've noticed is that Wicca in the US seems to be, generally speaking, a little bit more rigid and a little bit more resistant to change than Wicca in the UK. And here I'm talking specifically about Gardnerian Wicca because that's the Wicca that I know, right? Obviously, solitary eclectic Wicca is very flexible, very open to change, because you do what works for you. But because we have solitary eclectic, or even coven-based eclectic, but we have, experimental forms of Wicca in the United States, a lot of the time when people come to Gardnerian Wicca, when people seek out a Gardnerian or an Alexandrian coven, what they're looking for is something that's got a little bit more of a rigid structure to it, that has sort of specific rituals that are done, that has a cohesive sense of belonging to a tradition where there's a continuity between what I do and what someone else over there does. And so a lot of the Americans are looking for a feeling of, for lack of a better word, sameness. And every coven is different. There are still quite noteworthy differences between what any three covens are doing in their rituals. Every coven has its own particular stamp. But there's also, generally speaking, in American Wicca, there's an expectation that any Gardnerian can walk into any other Gardnerian ritual and have a pretty solid sense of what's going on. Things might be done in a slightly different order or anything like that, but like generally speaking, the pieces are all there. And I think that the attitude toward Wicca in the UK tends to be a lot freer and a lot more experimental. People are interested in trying out different things or experimenting with new ritual forms or, any of those sorts of things. And I think there are probably a couple of reasons for that. One of them being that, if you're Wiccan and you want to experiment, you're going to experiment. Whereas in the US, if you want to experiment, you're probably never going to seek out a traditional coven to begin with, because you're going to stick with your own free-form experimental practice. And in the UK, because Wicca means a different thing, it's more like, okay, we're all Wiccan, we're all, doing this pagan religious witchcraft, but like, let's experiment, let's have fun with it, let's do new things. Let's not be stuck down in, oh, you have to do things exactly according to the letter of such and such. I think there's a feeling of much greater freedom with the tradition, because the tradition is just sort of like the existence of Wicca. Whereas in America, the tradition is juxtaposed with eclectic and experimental styles of practice. So that if you're drawn to the Gardnerian or Alexandrian traditions, you're probably less interested in magical experimentation along those lines. You probably want something that's a little bit more tamped down. And, I think there's genuine value in both of them. Obviously, I, being an American, um, am much more inclined to a sort of conservative, I like to do it the same way every time approach to ritual. Um, I get a lot out of having that continuity, having the sort of doing it the same way every time. And that's part of why I decided to look for Gardnerian Wicca to begin with. But at the same time, doing things by rote is the death of magic. You want to have creativity. You want to have room to explore things and to do new things. But it's really interesting, particularly, you know, even just 5 years ago. Things have changed a lot in the past 5 years, but even just 5 years ago, you'd have Americans and Brits talking to each other, and the Americans would be like, oh, of course, when such and such happens, and the Brits would be like, but not everyone does such and such, you know? Or the Brits would say, yeah, our coven has experimented with, I don't know, archangels or whatever. And the Americans would be like, archangels, like, where's that? That's not in the tradition. And there would just be a little bit of like people missing each other, because in the British culture of Wicca, there's an assumption that you're supposed to experiment, that you're supposed to innovate, right? Their view is that Gardner sort of very purposefully put out a basic structure with the intention for each coven to innovate and build on it and create their own style of the craft. And the view in America is, I think, a lot more hostile to experimentation. Hostile is a strong word, but a lot less inclined to experimentation, and a lot more inclined to seek out the way that everyone does it, or the way it should be done, or the right way to do it. And I think there are pros and cons to both sides. I'm not passing a value judgment here. I have my personal preferences for the way that I like to be in ritual. Other people have their own personal preferences, and like I say, each coven is different. That's a really important thing in Wicca, is that each coven is different. But I think it's helpful just to be conscious of that cultural difference, because it's a background assumption that can fuel, uh, general cross communication or misunderstanding between people. When some people have the assumption that of course we're supposed to be experimenting, and some people have the assumption that of course we're supposed to be doing the same thing every time. Um, and this, I think, feeds into actually quite nicely the third broad cultural difference that I want to talk about, which is, I think that, once again, speaking in very general terms, there are obviously exceptions to this on both sides of the pond. But I think that, broadly speaking, American Gardnerians conceive of what we're doing, what the purpose of the tradition, as the priesthood of two specific deities. Whereas I think that British Gardnerians and Alexandrians, British initiatory Wiccans, are more inclined to see the tradition as sort of a ritual framework for experiencing certain mysteries and the practicing of witchcraft. And those two things are closely related, right? Like, the Americans also think that we're supposed to be experiencing certain mysteries and practicing witchcraft, and the Brits also think that we're a priesthood, but the emphasis is slightly different. And part of what that means is that the Brits who are thinking about what we're doing, like the purpose of what we do is in the witchcraft or in the mysteries, they see it. I don't want to put words in other people's mouths, but my impression is that if you put the emphasis on those things, that lends itself much more to experimentation and innovation of a certain kind. Because if your purpose is to be practicing witchcraft, then just do magic and do different kinds of magic. Try new styles of magic. Um, and if your purpose is to experience certain mysteries, there are lots of different ways to experience those mysteries. So mess around with it. Try something new. If you want to experience, I don't know, the mystery of the tides, and the relationship between the moon and the tides. Like, there are so many different ways to approach that ritually, and you can build new rituals and new ritual forms around that kind of thing. Um, Whereas if you think of yourself as primarily the priesthood of two particular deities, then the sort of expectation that gets imported with that view is that those deities have particular rites that are done in their honor, and you don't want to fuck with that as much, because those are the rites. For these deities, we have these rites, and the same way that, like, a Catholic priest is not going to change up the mass. Um, and likewise, not every coven in the UK is going to think of themselves as worshiping two particular deities. In the UK, it's, I think, much more common for people to bring in a variety of deities into their coven practice. If you have a coven that's in Bath, I think it's Bath, right, where there was a temple of Minerva, a Roman temple of Minerva, um, it might feel perfectly natural to you to work with and worship the goddess Minerva in a coven setting, because she's the goddess of the town. She's the goddess who was there present with you. And if you see yourself as experiencing certain mysteries, practicing witchcraft, and as a priesthood more generally, rather than as a priesthood of two specific deities, it might feel quite natural to operate as a priesthood for the local goddess, the goddess of the land wherever you might happen to be, which is a very different perspective than operating as the priesthood of this particular goddess and this particular god. And I once again, I don't mean to pass value judgments in any direction here, because everyone, at the end of the day, all of us are doing Wicca and doing it well and doing it right. Um, but I think it's interesting because I think that sometimes the things that we're trying to do differ from each other. And I think that there are times where uh, Americans and Brits sort of come into interaction with each other and are confused by each other because the Americans are over here thinking that we're supposed to be doing X, the Brits are over here thinking that we're supposed to be doing Y, and each of us is confused as to why the other doesn't seem to be prioritizing the same things that we prioritize. So I think that just being sensitive to those broad differences in the climate of Wicca can really help us to understand each other and to understand why different covens make the choices that they make in ritual, in worship, and so on. Um, Whereas, if we all assume that everyone is trying to do the same thing, it's very easy to fall into the expectation, not the expectation, the judgment that, like, oh, those people are doing it wrong because they're not actually trying to do what you're trying to do. They're trying to do something totally different. Well, not totally different, related, but sort of they're placing their emphasis on a different part of this very large and complicated thing that is traditional Wicca, right? Wicca has all these moving parts, and you can, as a coven, you can choose to highlight and emphasize some of those over others. And when you do that, it's going to affect the way that you practice more broadly. And when you have sort of communities of people who are making primarily some choices over others, it's going to affect the way that those communities practice more broadly. Um, so I don't know. It's my final thought, and then I'll leave off here, is just that I think the cross pollination between the U.S. and the U.K. has been very good. Uh, I hope for both communities. Certainly, it's been very good for the American community. But prior to the internet, it was a lot harder for covens to communicate across the Atlantic, and we've learned about so much diversity in the way that covens practice. And it's I think really a wonderful thing to see all the different ways that people approach this strange thing that we do that's called Wicca. So I'm going to leave off there. Hopefully this has been an enjoyable video. Hopefully this has been somewhat edifying. And if you have thoughts of your own about the difference and the similarities between Gardnerian and Alexandrian initiatory Wicca in the US versus the UK, please do feel free to share them. I'm curious to hear your thoughts. So thank you all so much, and catch you next time.